So you found a skeleton. How would you tell it to recognize? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.
Hey there YouTube, the Dapper Dinosaur here. This is the last of the Frank Turek videos, at least about this particular talk. We're starting out getting a Dawkins quote allegedly about the fossil record and its incompleteness. This is in the context of Turek not knowing what gradualism versus punctuated equilibrium is. After that, it's going to go away from the science, but there's still enough that's interesting that I think I'm going to stick with it. Anyway, here he is.
Without gradualness, we are back to a miracle. That's why he went after Stephen Jay Gould, because Stephen Jay Gould came up with the punctuated equilibria theory, which said that evolution took these jumps. He had no mechanism by which he could show evidence for this, but he just said it must be.
Actually, he did propose mechanisms, such as the founder effect, new environments causing new selection pressures, and perhaps most significantly, population selection. Now, it turns out that the most important part of punctuated equilibrium, population selection, has been largely discarded, and the founder effect, as well as new environments leading to directional selection, aren't exactly all that new or unique to Gould. That being said, it remains the case that small populations evolve faster than large ones, and that while it's easy to say trace the evolution of mammals from basal synapsids, or of modern canines from basal so-called miacids, it's virtually impossible to trace through fossils the evolution of all the members of, say, genus Canis or Vulpes, from their common ancestor as a genus.
Why? Because philosophically, he's already decided evolution's true. So evolution wasn't gradual in his view, it took these hopeful monster jumps somehow.
Except that hopeful monster jumps are not what Gould was proposing. That's saltationism, and is again distinct from either gradualism or punctuated equilibrium. It is essentially the idea that occasionally huge morphological changes happen in a single generation. The classic example is a crocodile laying an egg out of which a bird hatches. This is not the evolution of a new but very similar species in an isolated population too fast to reliably leave a good fossil record, but still so slow as to leave parents and offspring very much alike. The fact that Turek can't distinguish between the very different ideas of punctuated equilibrium and saltation says far more about his ability to discuss evolution than anything he said so far about evolution itself.
No evidence for this.
See, I don't know if he means by this punctuated equilibrium or saltation, and while granted there's really no evidence of saltationism, or for things like species selection, I'm not sure why that's supposed to be a problem.
He's just backing his philosophy, or assuming his philosophy before he looks at the evidence.
Look, I'm not here to defend Dawkins' philosophical positions. I'm sure he and I would disagree on a lot of them. But I just have to point out the irony of someone who is willing to reject virtually all of science on the grounds that he has already assumed his particular interpretation of the Bible trumps all possible evidence, complaining about Dawkins. I think Frank missed his true calling as a movie theater projectionist.
And therefore comes up with that. Last thing from Dawkins here.
I hope that's true. I'm really tired of Dawkins.
We already read this earlier. He does have a philosophical commitment to materialism and reductionism. Cool,
but I don't. Neither is required to study evolution for it to be true, so who cares? Dawkins isn't the king of biology. He's not Emir al-Ilm. His philosophy isn't mandatory for scientists or students. He's one guy who's pretty good at biology and absolutely atrocious at most other things. And, who has supported or at least failed to condemn some pretty heinous stuff and is a bigot. I don't care about Dawkins. He has never represented me, and I've never really been a huge fan. I bet Frank would complain, fairly, if I made a video about how much Christianity sucks and I focused on people like Joel Osteen. And he'd be right to do so. Joel Osteen no more represents Christians than Dawkins does people who don't reject science, in part because Dawkins himself has become a bit of a science denier when it comes to biological sex.
Which, again, means he's ruling out intelligence beforehand, he's begging the question, he's assuming what he's trying to prove, and he is falling right into what Einstein said.
Actually, he's not ruling out intelligence. He has allowed for directed panspermia as a bare possibility, which would mean intelligence. Now, he doesn't personally believe in directed panspermia, but by not ruling it out, he has also not ruled out intelligence. Now, he has ruled out supernatural options, but I still don't care about that. Dawkins' philosophical conclusions are of no bearing whatever to whether evolution is true or not.
That, unfortunately, the man of science is a poor philosopher.
Well, at least when it comes to Dawkins, I can't disagree.
All right, let's go back to Flew, who famously said, follow the evidence where it leads. Who is Anthony Flew? He was the philosophical atheist of the last century, probably the most prominent one, who wrote the article for atheism in the Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
Yep, and he famously became a theist not long before his death. I have no opinions on that fact, but I bet Frank sure does.
And in 2005 became kind of a theist, maybe a deist, but he rejected atheism because of the DNA argument, basically, intelligent design. And he always said...
Sounds like he didn't know too much about evolution, just like Dawkins doesn't know too much about philosophy.
Even when he was an atheist, we gotta follow the evidence where it leads. Where does it lead? It appears to lead back to an intelligent designer. Does science say that?
No, it does not, because so far the only predictions that intelligent design can make that are not the same as those of the theory of evolution have been shown to be false. Most notably in neutral variation, which can easily be used to distinguish between common ancestry and common design but separate ancestry. Indeed, intelligent design is banned from being taught in public classrooms in the United States specifically because it is not science.
No, scientists say that.
Oh yeah, I forgot. We're on some stupid tirade against anthropomorphization for some reason. Presumably because Turek is a clod who understands figurative language about as well as Drax.
Nothing goes over my head. My reflexes are too fast. I would catch it.
That's what I'm saying. I think that's what the evidence shows.
I'm sure he does think that, but this is a guy who has shown time and time again that he has no clue how to assess the evidence, or even what evidence exists. I mean, this is the guy who can't tell the difference between punctuated equilibrium and saltation.
Now, I could be wrong.
Yeah, maybe.
Here's the big so what. Last thing. Richard Lalonde, atheist, teaches at Harvard. He's an atheist, a Marxist, a Darwinist, all the ists, okay?
You gotta poison that well.
In 1997, he had a very honest moment when he wrote in the New York Times Review of Books why he and his fellow colleagues don't believe in miracles. He said, it's not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world, but on the contrary, that we are forced by our a priori, meaning our prior adherence to material causes, to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door.
I agree that science doesn't force materialism onto people. One of the ways to tell is to notice how many scientists are themselves supernaturalists. Indeed, not far from where I live is an astronomical observatory, and quite a few of the telescopes are actually owned by the Vatican. While I have many problems with the Vatican as an institution, I don't think they could be reasonably said to be full of philosophical materialists. Science relies on predictability and falsification. The fact is, not all possibly true propositions are easily tested by way of science. Some supernatural claims are in this category, so while I don't think science provides reason on its own to accept them, neither would I expect it to if they were true. This is why most theist scientists don't expect God to leap out at them from their test tubes or telescopes or microscopes or whatever.
Materialism is absolute. We can't allow God in. Why not? Why can't they allow God in?
Well, I won't speak for Lawton because I don't know him, and frankly, I don't care what he thinks about philosophy. The reason we can't really allow God into science is that we don't know how to predict his actions, and they seem to be unpredictable. If God acted predictably, for instance, if there were a detectable threshold of prayer that would actually cure cancer, then he would be let in the door of science. If God exists, he seems not to operate in such a predictable way. And further, what could possibly falsify the notion that God did something? I don't know. So because the hypothesis of miracle has no predictive power and can't be falsified, it's fundamentally not a scientific idea. It has no place in science whether true or not. And the thing is, many things that are true aren't scientific ideas. The assassination of Julius Caesar is a true thing that happened, but it has no predictive power, so it's not exactly something that comes up in science. Science doesn't equal things that are true. It's just one tool that humans use to figure out the reality around them. Now, within its scope, it's fantastically useful, but its scope simply isn't all possible true statements.
Well, if God gets in, no longer are they seen as the new priests who dispense truth to the general public.
Sure, that might be the motive Lawton and his buddies have, but it's not the motive of most scientists, because that's not how scientists tend to see themselves. Indeed, I doubt very much that the Catholics who run the telescopes see themselves as priests of a new atheist religion. In fact, I suspect many of them are actually priests of an old, very much theistic religion.
No longer will they be able to get grant money from the major institutions and from the United States government.
No one gets grant money to promote atheism. Grant money comes when there's a good chance you'll get results. Now, that does mean you're not likely to get money to show that God exists, because fundamentally the hypothesis doesn't really lend itself to scientific testing, at least for the God concepts with which I'm most familiar. But again, plenty of theists get grant money.
No longer will they be seen as buddies with their materialistic colleagues if they let God in.
Maybe, although, materialists can be friends with non-materialists. Maybe Frank can't do that, but I feel like most people can. Friends don't all have to have the same beliefs and philosophical commitments. I doubt I know anyone I can call a friend with whom I agree on absolutely everything with a truth value. That's just life.
And ultimately, they're going to have to bow their knee to a creator because God brings with him moral restraints.
No, Frank's God brings that, but the concept of a God does not. Moral expectations are a common part of God concepts, but they are not necessary. Maybe God just doesn't care what you do. Maybe he's actually immoral. Maybe his morality is so alien to humans that we wouldn't even recognize it as a moral philosophy. Maybe God has moral preferences but doesn't judge humans against those preferences. All of these and more are possible. Belief in a God does not require any particular set of moral beliefs. Now, believing in Turek's God specifically might, but that's neither here nor there. I was, before the series, given to believe that Turek's thing was philosophy, but he's showing himself to be atrociously bad at it, about as bad as he is at biology. Maybe he just sucks at everything except telling a certain group of Christians things they want to hear.
Ron Carlson, who speaks at a lot of college campuses, said once he went into a college campus situation, he was speaking at the invitation of a biology professor, talking about the problems with Darwinism, and after the lecture was over, he had lunch with the professor, and he said to the professor, "What do you think of my lecture?"
This sounds suspiciously like Kent Hovind's almost certainly fabricated story about talking to a UC Berkeley professor on a plane ride.
And the professor said, "Well, Ron, what I think you say is true, but I'm going to keep teaching Darwinism anyway."
Yeah, I'm calling bullshit. Just the professor calling it Darwinism is enough for me to say that this did not happen as reported. That's just not how this conversation would go.
And Ron said, "Why would you do that?" And the professor said, "Because if Darwinism's true, if we did evolve from slimy green algae without intelligent intervention, if there is no God, then I can sleep with whoever I want. Darwinism is morally comfortable."
No one talks like that, and further, nothing about evolution means that there isn't a God making moral impositions that he'll judge you for. The existence of a moral God who cares to judge humans for their actions is a separate question from the mechanism by which biodiversity comes into existence. Maybe evolution is true and God really, really cares what professors do with their genitals. Maybe evolution is false and God couldn't care less what uglies you bump. Maybe evolution is false and God really cares. There's no necessary correlation between these two, and Turek is arguing as if the options are atheistic evolution and Christianity, except that that's not true. There are many options a person could take that are neither atheistic evolution nor Christianity. You can tell simply by the fact that not all non-atheists are Christians. Some are Jewish, Hindu, Druze, Zoroastrian, etc.
At least he's being honest, right?
No, I'm pretty sure this exchange never happened, especially as it's being reported as secondhand hearsay. One of my friends went to an evangelical Christian school to teach evolution, and afterwards he and the professor sat down to talk. The professor told him that he had a lot of good points and that Darwinism was true, but that he'd keep teaching Jesusology. My friend asked why, and the professor said that without Jesus, he couldn't see any reason to stay married. At least he's being honest. Or, maybe that whole thing is incredible in the strict sense, and neither I nor Frank have anything to back up our extremely outlandish tales.
Now, is that the motivation for all scientists who are Darwin? No, I don't know. I'm just saying for him it was.
Who's the him? It's an unnamed college professor in an unnamed school. Next thing you know, Turek will be telling us how his cousin's friend was attacked by a hooked-handed prison escapee in his car, but the only evidence was the deep gouges in the car's body.
Thomas Nagel, who teaches at NYU, said, speaking of Hitchens and Dawkins, they seem to have a cosmic authority problem.
I don't even know what that's supposed to mean.
In fact, I don't want there to be a God either, he said. I don't want the world to be like that. I don't want there to be a God.
Okay, I can see pros and cons. I don't know why this matters. Some people want there to not be a God. Frank is one of the ones who I suspect does want there to be a God. Is he saying that believing things you want to believe is bad? Because if so, then boy is it time for him to look at his own life.
Remember, science doesn't say anything scientists do, and a lot of times scientists have ulterior motives.
Great, but unless that's entering their actual science, it doesn't ultimately matter. Unless there are scientists publishing all sorts of studies trying to falsify theism, then whatever they want to believe about God doesn't matter. What matters is the actual data and analysis that they put into their published work, and whether that is something others can replicate or find flaws in. Anyone can do good work in science and have their work become part of the body of knowledge of science, and they can do it without needing an ideological purity test, and usually without most people even knowing what their religious affiliation is, if any.
that prevent them from following the evidence where it leads, which is a problem because they are making authoritative statements in our society now, and when we don't counter them, our kids, many of them walk away, and only about a third come back by the time they're age 30.
Somehow, I think this has far more to do with the lies that were told by people like Turek than it has to do with kids learning true things about the history of the world. But then again, it's not like I'm a church attendance expert, so what do I know?
They walk away from the church.
I can't imagine why they'd want to walk away from an organization whose spokesperson seems to know less than nothing about everything he talks about. I wouldn't want to be part of an organization that puts this guy on a pedestal either.
So, as Paul said, test all things.
I agree, test all things. The great thing about evolution is that people have been testing it for well over a century, and it keeps on being not falsified. Every time it's tested and found to not be rejected, that increases our confidence in the accuracy of our understanding of biology. Interestingly, the exact opposite keeps happening to separate ancestry, and intelligent design makes so few predictions it's hard to see how it even could be tested.
Don't believe blindly what Einstein, Behe, or Dawkins or anyone says. Look at the evidence for yourself.
I did, and I came to the inevitable conclusion that Einstein was mostly right, Darwin was too, that Behe is a clown, and that Turek is either profoundly ignorant or a liar. Unfortunately, I've more and more come to the conclusion that well-educated creationists are knowingly dishonest. And it's not because I didn't want to believe in God that I did this. When I first investigated evolution, it was very much as a believing an active member of an evangelical church. And my discovering that it was true did not change that fact. The fact did change eventually, but it was for reasons entirely unconnected to evolutionary theory. Although I have to say, the fact that so many evangelical so-called scientists had been lying to me my whole life wasn't exactly an inducement to stay.
Because it's laden with philosophy on all sides of it, and science doesn't say anything scientists do.
That doesn't even mean anything, man.
All right, any questions?
Yeah, lots. But they're not likely to be answered by Frank.
By the way, there's more in this in the book. Any questions for Sean? Let's get him the mic, please.
Great, great talk. I'm appreciative of so many people in the room who've helped me think more clearly, starting Greg's comment long ago that I took to heart, which is ask people what they mean by evolution. Mm-hmm. There's an example in Science this month of science.
I hate when people in Q&A sessions don't ask questions. Just ask your question and be done. Don't give me your life story, or say, this isn't really a question, but... Just have a question in mind and ask it.
Changing the term again, there's an article on the fruit fly who's adapted a symbiotic relationship with a bacteria. That bacteria confers an advantage to protect against a fungus, which is killing or hurting the fruit fly.
I haven't heard about this, but it sounds like a neat example of the evolution of symbiosis.
This is now evolution.
I mean, if it came with a change in the allele frequencies of either the fly or the bacteria or both, then yes. If it's just the novel colonization of these flies by the bacteria without any genetic change, then no, it's not evolution, at least not yet. What that would be is a change in the environment for both the flies and the bacteria.
This is evidence in the journal Science that this is an evolutionary adaptation. And what are they saying? They've adopted a new genome into it.
So then yes, there has been a genetic change in at least one population, meaning that yes, definitionally, this is evolution. It's obviously not all of evolution, but that doesn't make it not evolution. No one paper is going to be published with all we know about evolution. It wouldn't even be possible to read such a paper in a single lifetime, never mind write one, and no writer could keep up with the new discoveries anyway. Just complaining that an example of evolution isn't on its own enough to explain all of evolution is incredibly disingenuous at worst, and extremely stupid at best.
All it is bacteria and the fruit fly living together, but the title is Evolutionary Adaptation.
I can't find any paper in Nature from the time of this talk or earlier that matches this description.
And so again, this isn't, descent with modification through natural selection.
The descent with modification is all we need for it to be evolution, provided that modification is genetic modification. Natural selection is a mechanism of evolution, but even when it's not in play, evolution still occurs. But I'm not clear on why this isn't evolution. His statements about genomes make me think that there were genetic changes in at least one of the species under consideration. So what's the problem here?
This is using this generic term to sort of
gloss
this
over
cloud
right.
of and so
right.
Great example there.
Of what? So far it sounds like a great example of evolution, but because I don't even know what paper we're talking about, I can't say for sure.
Like
So,
climate
great.
change.
What the does climate change have to do with this? I guess it's just that Turek is also a denialist about that.
Yeah. And one other comment, if we're doing feedback,
Well, feedback wasn't solicited, but questions were.
the notion of the scientists and why would they do this? Exactly. I see the personal agendas of scientists. We're human, and we're all sinners.
Interesting. What's the agenda of Dr. Mary Schweitzer or Robert T. Bacher, both professing Christian paleontologists who are firmly in the camp of actual science when it comes to things like common ancestry, evolution, and the age of the Earth? Because I bet they don't have as part of their agenda to discourage the belief in the God they themselves worship.
I think it would be perfect to walk right into Romans 1, 19 and 20 at that point.
Go ahead.
Nah.
Yes, sir.
Just a word about bias.
Yeah, this is the crowd that needs to warn people to beware of bias. As if the whole point of peer review in science wasn't to make sure that bias isn't a deciding factor in science. Somehow, I doubt that Turek is put through anything like peer review to remove his bias. If anything, his peers share and encourage his bias. That would explain why he's so bad at this.
And I owe this observation to J.P. Moreland. J.P. said that in this enterprise, a scientific enterprise, it would be fair to say that both the Christian and the materialist have biases, if what one means by that is that they have preconceived notions about what is possible, and maybe they have come to conclusions about what actually took place.
Again with the stupid false dichotomy of Christian and materialist. I know this isn't true of most Christians, but there seems to be a set of Christians who just can't imagine the idea that other religions exist. Well, they do. Further, one doesn't have to believe in any particular religion to believe in non-material or supernatural things. Maybe someone is not affiliated with any religion, but believes that there are ghosts.
But Buddy points out, and this is the observation I think you can take to the bank,
I very much doubt any bank would want any of this.
the bias of the theist informs the discussion in a different way than the bias of a materialist. The bias of the materialist limits the options that the kinds of answers that he can come up with in any circumstance. He has got to come up with answers that comport with naturalism and materialism, okay? The bias of the theist, though, is different. It expands the kinds of explanations that are available to him.
This is strictly true, but in the context of science, the expanded set of options aren't useful, because they're not amenable to scientific testing, and so they're not able to be considered in science. Scientific ideas have to be testable, and so if your philosophical position allows you to consider untestable possibilities, that's fine, but what you can't then do is pretend that those options are things science can consider. They're fundamentally pseudoscientific options, even if they're right, so the theist is at no advantage in terms of science. If a supernatural cause is the real cause of a phenomenon under scientific investigation, then the most science will be able to do is to fail to make progress in explaining that phenomenon. The origin of life and evolution are not in such a circumstance, so they don't even meet the best possible case scenario for an indication of a supernatural God cause. And of course, even without progress, that doesn't make the reason God. So even if it were the case that there were not progress in those areas, it wouldn't actually be evidence that God did it miraculously. It just wouldn't be evidence that God didn't do it miraculously. And I add in the miraculous bit because most Christians believe that the main way God acts in the world is in fact through natural processes, all of which he put in place in his creation of the universe. And so in some sense, natural processes are an outgrowth of the will of God. Science has absolutely nothing to say about that, but it's why so many theist scientists have seen their investigation of the natural world using natural mechanisms as an investigation into the mind of God, from which they believe flow the principles according to which the universe acts and is organized. I'm not here to advocate for that position, but just to point out that even methodological naturalism does not preclude a belief in a God or an atheist agenda like Koukl is implying.
He can take and adopt a materialistic explanation if it turns out to be the best explanation for the circumstances. So you hear thunder and you say, well, what is that? Is that the gods bowling? I don't know, let's check it out. Then you find out that there is a materialistic explanation that's completely adequate to the task.
Jesus hit a strike.
Yeah. But the theist has also has the alternative of a non-materialist or a non-event causation. They can go to an agent that is outside of the system if the evidence warrants it.
Cool, now we just need to see evidence that warrants stepping outside of natural explanations when it comes to evolution. Turek sure didn't give any. Further, notice how close this is to just the God of the gaps. because the places anyone is most likely to suspect the evidence warrants stepping away from methodological naturalism are exactly those areas with no currently known adequate naturalistic explanation. Sure, the idea that you want positive evidence for the action of a non-material actor technically moves it out of the realm of the god of the gaps, but what would such evidence look like? I don't know, and I don't think Koukl knows either.
So JP's point is that the bias of the theist actually allows the theist to follow the evidence where it leads.
Maybe, but what we've actually seen in this talk is theists following evidence to where it absolutely does not lead. So in practice, the minor advantage of this extra explanatory freedom seems to be countered by an inappropriate bias towards invoking supernatural explanations, despite adequate naturalistic explanations. In the end, there's no clear advantage to theism, and there could even be a disadvantage, although I wouldn't go to the trouble of arguing for that, since frankly I'm too lazy for that.
So his bias, that is his expanded view then, is actually an advantage in discovering the truth.
Funny then how theists aren't overrepresented in science, but rather underrepresented. It's almost like it doesn't really give an advantage in science. Maybe it gives an advantage in other areas, but it doesn't seem to in the domain of science, which is what we're talking about here.
Where a materialist is not allowed to follow the evidence where it leads, he is only allowed to follow the evidence to a materialistic conclusion.
Which, at least in terms of methodological naturalism, has led to the invention of the technology that Koukl is relying on to record and display his image in words. Seems to be working pretty well, and it also seems like a reason to oppose the idea of getting rid of methodological naturalism in science. At least until someone figures out how to make technology that reliably works on the basis of a non-natural entity. Let me know when the reliable prayer-powered light bulb comes out.
So his bias, then, in principle at least, can restrict the pursuit of truth.
The Christian's more open-minded.
Do I even need to say anything about that?
Yes,
That's
we're open
the
to
lesson.
both causes. We're open
Exactly.
to intelligent and non-intelligent causes. Yes, go ahead.
The very existence of this talk is prima facie evidence that, at least in some areas, these Christians are absolutely not open to natural explanations. Because we have that, and they reject it anyway. This whole video series shows that when Frank Turek says he's more open-minded than naturalists, and is willing to accept natural explanations when there is evidence for such explanations, he's just lying.
Well, just to agree with Greg on that, Paul Nelson did a talk at Biola a couple of years ago where he was talking about this exact thing, and he was saying, if you're a carpenter, you want all the tools you need in order to do the job. And in essence, what's happening in the origin of life debate is they're taking away a tool where you cannot explain certain things at all.
Maybe, but progress keeps being made, so it seems that that tool hasn't been necessary so far.
You just can't do the job. And Paul Nelson's very good at showing how there's certain things that require intelligence. He does some things where, if...
Maybe I should look into this Paul Nelson guy.
A band, marching band spells out cow on the field. That takes prior notion. It's a teleology argument. And he's like, you can't, if you don't have the tool of explaining with intelligence, you can't explain cow on the field.
Okay, but fun fact, this isn't an analogy for anything explained by evolution. What part of the marching band is the genetic code? What about the crowd reading the words spelled out by the band is analogous to anything in biology? I don't know. It seems like an abysmally bad analogy.
So I just wanted to agree with Greg on that.
Good for you, guy.
Very good. You can explain cow dung, but not cow. Okay? And even then, you need an intelligent cow to do that. Yes, go ahead.
It is very important the way you pointed out there's different types of science.
There are different kinds of science, but science isn't divided up into historical and operational science. The distinctions Turek likes to draw are ones foreign to the actual scientists doing real science.
The general public has been kind of educated to think that science is empirical science and it's proven.
Well, definitionally, all science is empirical. If what you're doing isn't empirical, then what you're doing isn't science. But also, I don't like the word proven, as all of science is provisional. It's just that some of the provisionally held conclusions of science are so robust and long-standing that we no longer realistically expect them to be overturned. The theory of evolution is as close to being proved as anything in science really is, at least in broad terms.
Both of which aren't accurate. Because the thing that they're starting to get in school districts, but only barely, is that there's also HD, hypothetical deductive science, hypothetical inductive science, and
That is a term I was not familiar with, but let's see what Britannica has to say about it, as they'll give a concise explanation. If we need to, I can get more extensive sources. Quote, hypothetico-deductive method. Procedure for the construction of a scientific theory that will account for the results obtained through direct observation and experimentation, and that will, through inference, predict further effects that can be verified or disproved by empirical evidence derived from other experiments. An early version of the hypothetico-deductive method was proposed by the Dutch physicist Christian Huygens, 1629 through 95. The method generally assumes that properly formed theories are conjectures intended to explain a set of observable data. These hypotheses, however, cannot be conclusively established until the consequences that logically follow from them are verified through additional observations and experiments. The method treats theory as a deductive system in which particular empirical phenomena are explained by relating them back to general principles and definitions. However, it rejects the claim of Cartesian mechanics that those principles and definitions are self-evident and valid. It assumes that their validity is determined only by the exact light their consequences throw on previously unexplained phenomena, or on actual scientific problems. End quote. Well, now we know what it is. I'm not sure how this is important to the question of evolution versus pseudoscience, but maybe this guy will tell us.
It's supposed to be taught, like a school district near us, they have it as part of their objectives, but there's maybe one page on it, and they don't really teach it.
I'm not sure what it is that he wants them to teach exactly. That axioms are bad in science? That direct observation and experimentation is important?
So if that's brought into the consciousness a little bit better, they'll realize, or the hypocrisy will be exposed a little bit more.
How so? I don't know how the hypothetico-deductive method of science poses some challenge for evolution or some great advantage for intelligent design. One group of people who wouldn't pretend that some model for how science already works is a problem for the science it describes are my subscribers. So if you don't want to be a weird pseudoscientist who can't explain the philosophy of science while relying on it to make his stupid points, why not subscribe? While you're at it, make sure to turn on all notifications and like this video. All those things really help me out.
But like you called it forensic science, but it's recognized that there are other types. I mean, most things Einstein did, that he's making, inductions and...
Right.
Yeah, which were then backed up by direct observations and experiments, which makes what he did seem entirely compatible. Indeed, it's not even proposed as a new method of science, but rather as more of a description and framework for understanding how science works. Now, some have argued that since it seems to have a binary falsification versus confirmation dichotomy, whereas actual science is all about probabilities, that this way of looking at science is incomplete, something I tend to agree with.
But, yes...
It can also be called origin science, whereas empirical science is called operation science, however you want to term it.
I just can't escape Ken Ham, can I?
What's that?
Historical science.
Historical science is another way of looking at it. When we do New Testament, we're doing historical science.
No, you're not. You might be doing history with New Testament texts as your sources, or some of your sources, but science and history are not the same thing. They don't have the same techniques, although they can and do interact.
Right. It's still a science. Bobby, you had something? Pass him that back if you would. And just two more, and then we got to take a break for lunch, and then we're going to come back for Richard.
They might come back, but I don't plan to.
Thank you. This is real quick. Just from your experience with the whole topic of science, philosophy, in your experience in other churches presenting the Big Bang and whatnot, you had mentioned this yesterday, I believe, pretty quick. Do you get much pushback from young earthers, 6,000 years versus, millions, billions, Cambrian periods and that kind of thing?
Yeah,
Can you
great.
Explain a little bit?
Yeah, great question. Here's how I answer it.
This is an interesting question. The only reason to think that the history of life is better explained by Frank's ideas than evolution is the idea that the Bible is in some ways literally true. And the young earthers are more consistent with that idea than Frank is, and the young and flat earthers even more so. The only thing Frank can really do is to point to evidence of the old age of the Earth, just like young earthers counter flat earthers with evidence of the large-scale positive curvature of the Earth's surface. But there's a problem with that. Theistic evolutionists can do the same thing to counter Turek's anti-evolution. So I am curious how he deals with this problem.
Okay, and you can get a lot of hostility. So I always say, look, I don't know how old the Earth is. Could be old, could be young.
What a cop-out.
On Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, I think it's old. On Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday, I think it's young. And on Sunday, I take the day off.
So he addresses it by just avoiding the problem. How convenient. And I guess it's the case that there are some problems I'm not interested in tackling, so I suppose I can't judge too harshly. But still, this seems like an easy topic to get evidence about and form a conclusion. Just ask yourself, do you care about the evidence or your already decided conclusion on the basis of your interpretation of a particular collection of books?
The most important point is that there was a creation, not when there was a creation.
I mean, from Turek's point of view, that seems fair, but then it's still an important part of your interpretive framework for the Bible, as well as for your basic epistemological framework, whether your interpretation trumps the physical evidence or not. Turek is clearly willing to toss out and not engage with the evidence when it runs counter to what he considers his core beliefs, but isn't willing to do that consistently. Maybe he deep down knows just how stupid a young Earth is, but because it's what his theological commitments dispose him to, he just lives in a permanent state of dissonance and so can't talk about the topic. I can't say. I'm not a psychologist, and I'm not even a linguist. I'm just a dinosaur. I bite the heads off of sauropods.
And I illustrate, I say, the evidence seems to lean more toward an old universe, but you're still making assumptions you can't prove. For example, you have to assume the speed of light hasn't changed.
Actually, no, we don't, because if it had changed, we could see that in the emission spectra of distant objects. We don't.
Principle of uniformity? Probably a good assumption.
Yeah, it's the assumption that allows any science at all. Without it, there's no way for inductive reasoning to work at all. It's a well-known fact that induction needs the axiom of the uniformity of nature in order to be valid. Without the assumption that the universe operates the same in the past, present, future, as well as at distance, there's no reason for past experience to predict future experience.
But some are saying they can detect variations in the speed of light now. So I'm not 100% sure it hasn't changed.
All I'm aware of is new measurements that all tend to agree within their margins of error, and studies about light getting a lower effective speed in various media, such as oil or water.
Any other sort of dating method requires assumptions you can't prove, including all the carbon dating methods, uranium dating, decay rates, all have to be assumed. You can't be absolutely sure.
Well, you can't be absolutely sure about anything in science, but other than the assumption that allows for induction in the first place, I still haven't found any creationists giving any of these assumptions that are actually untested assertions. They're all assumed not because we need them to be true, but because they've already been tested, and so now we can use these ideas in future science. If you want to do some physics, you don't have to start over with Newtonian mechanics and then personally demonstrate and derive all of physics from there. You can just start with well-established physics as a background assumption. But importantly, that doesn't mean that the rest of physics is believed without evidence. That's the opposite of what's going on. It's the same with radiometric dating. The assumptions are not simply accepted for funsies. They're the conclusion of other science which is already well established.
With regard to the Bible, does the Bible necessarily teach a young Earth?
It depends on what parts you want to take literally. Everyone picks and chooses.
Not necessarily. Why? Because the day Yom in Hebrew could mean more than 24 hours. It does in Genesis 2:4, where it says the day the Lord created. The sixth day appears to take longer than is allotted because Adam names all the animals, right?
No, because the Genesis 2 creation account is a separate account from the 6-day creation account in Genesis 1. There's no particular day of creation in Genesis 2, nor is it clear that all the events in it take place on the same day. Nor did the author of Genesis 2 know how big a task naming all the animals was. That's part of the problem with trying to historicize these accounts. They aren't even compatible from one chapter to the next in much of Genesis. That's why everyone has to pick and choose which parts to take literally, which parts to take figuratively, and which parts to just ignore. I guess Frank is ignoring the genealogies and the solid dome over the flat earth with windows in it. Young earthers tend not to ignore the genealogies, but tend to ignore the whole dome and windows bit, whereas flurfs are all in.
And Brad Stein, a Christian comedian, has a bit on this. He said, that must have been a long day. In the beginning of the day, Adam was all fired up. He'd see an animal come by. He'd go, rhinoceros! Then he'd see another one come by. He'd go, hippopotamus! By the end of the day, cow.
That brings up a question. What language is Adam being imagined speaking? Is it Hebrew? We know Hebrew is not the oldest known language, so that seems unlikely. What's the deal? Let me know in the comments what you think if you have an idea. But note, I'm asking about the internal logic of the story, not whether it's true history or not.
He's just had it, you know. It seems to take longer. Also, the growth of fruit-bearing plants and all that seems to take longer.
Longer than what? Or maybe the author of Hebrews was just making an analogy and not a literal commentary on the timeline of creation. Just a thought. Also, of course, Genesis was compiled long before the book of Hebrews was composed, so it wasn't written with Hebrews in mind.
And finally, the seventh day certainly is longer than 24 hours because we're still in the seventh day right now, according to Hebrews 4.
Or maybe none of it is historical, and at best you can draw moral and theological ideas from it, but it has no bearing on the actual past history of the universe.
So if the seventh day is longer, maybe the other days are longer, right?
Well, I don't think the purpose of any of the authors of Genesis was to teach how old the earth was. I think they just had a background assumption that seeps through into their writing.
On the other hand, it could be 24-hour days. I mean, it could teach that it's young.
Already a laughably dumb thing to say since they are absolutely no more right than flat earthers, but let's let Frank cook.
Either way, the more important point is that God created. I can guarantee you this, and this is what I do say to young earthers. I say, you may be right.
Yeah, everyone knows that you're not Orthodox unless you join the one true Catholic and Apostolic Church, the Eastern Orthodox Church. Sorry, just a joke. I know that's not what he meant.
You may be. But let me just point this out. If you are right, don't make it a test for orthodoxy for everybody else.
Hey, just extend that argument to evolution and see why maybe being a dogmatic anti-evolutionist is also a bad move tactically for Christianity. The irony is basically blinding at this point.
Because if you make it a test for orthodoxy for everybody else, you may keep people out of the kingdom because you're saying in order to be a Christian, you've got to be a young earther when some scientist thinks the evidence is much better, that it's old. What, are you going to make me check my brains at the door? No, I'm not going to do that. Christianity's false now. And he's rejected the whole thing because of your young earth view.
Fun fact, the idea of dying and going to heaven as the general permanent post-mortem expectation of Christians is a fairly recent thing. Historically, there was some idea of dwelling with God, but the main thing was that Christians were awaiting the general resurrection of the dead when they would be physically raised from the dead with new bodies.
Because I guarantee you this, when you get to heaven, God isn't going to say, did you think it was old or young?
According to Frank's theology, sure, but not even all Christians share that theology. There are universalist Christians, and Christians who think that those who had insurmountable barriers to faith in Christ won't have that held against them, etc. I just like to point out the internal variation in Christianity because people like Turek often pretend that Christianity is far more homogeneous than it really is, and that they represent the core of Christian belief and practice. They are incorrect about that, and in fact, people like Frank here are generally on the fringes both currently and historically when it comes to Christian belief and practice.
Old, you're out of here! No, what did you do with Jesus is going to be the issue, right?
There's no more debate about the age of the earth between science and creationists than there is about the germ theory of disease versus the miasma theory of disease.
So, it's an interesting topic, it's an intramural debate.
Who wants to bet that that strategy, if taken seriously, is already being undermined by Turek just by being an anti-evolutionist? I don't know, because I haven't actually seen this far, but let's find out, shall we?
But I don't think it's something we ought to divide over. I think we ought to just say, look, that God created is more important.
Two things to add to that, and these are strategic, so I'm not taking a side here.
Well, if you think the historicity of Genesis is an important part of the authority of the Bible, then they're right.
Those who are young earthers say if you don't take a young earth view that you're undermining the Bible and all of Christianity.
Mm-hmm. Hey, that's also true for the rejection of evolution, Greg. So I guess you should stop pushing that bullshit too. Oh man, who could have guessed I'd be right about where he was going with this? It's almost like I debunk this stuff for a living.
My experience has been it's just the opposite. If people have the sense that they have to accept a young earth view of the Bible, they aren't going to take anything in the Bible seriously because to them that is completely untenable.
Allow me to introduce the Christian ministry Biologos, who says exactly that about not just the Big Bang, but also evolution. The thing is that fundamentally, I don't really disagree with what Koukl is saying here. Now, I'm not here to push Christianity or make it seem more or less plausible on the whole. But if I were trying to push it and make it seem plausible, then I'd take as much from science as I could to see how I could use it in my favor. It's just that Greg isn't actually doing that. He's rejecting major aspects of science, even though based on the fact that most Christians don't do this, it's not necessary for him to do it. He should take his own advice that he applies to the old Earth and flat Earth and just apply it to evolution as well. Talk about how amazing God is that he set up a system whereby organisms can adapt and spread and diversify all on their own, without constant tinkering from some engineer who, by all appearances, kind of sucks at his job.
And so, there's a strategic concern there. There's a second element of strategic concern. If by adopting the Big Bang at face value and then using it in our favor, we are taking something that the other side actually believes is true and leveraging it to our effect. Instead of saying there was no Big Bang, we're going to say, okay, let's just pretend that your view is right, and let's see where it takes us. Well, your view takes us to our view. In other words, your assessment about the beginning of the universe is better explained by our worldview, not by your worldview. The third strategic element, too, is that if you It is hard enough to get people to trust Christ.
Sounds like a you problem, buddy.
We want to try to have them jump through as few hoops as is necessary for them to deal with the real issue, their rebellion against God.
Says the man currently participating in a talk all about setting up one of those hoops.
Evolution is a big problem.
Not for many Christians, including about half of my regular co-hosts on my live streams. That's right, I stream live on this channel every Tuesday and Saturday. So if you haven't seen any of those yet, why not check them out? While I do consider the scripted stuff on the channel the core of my output, those are fun opportunities to hang out with my viewers, have fun, and dunk on some peak stupid. Usually of the creationist variety, but not always.
So we're going to try to deal with that and nullify that as a barrier.
The quick way to do that is to just stop pretending it's a barrier in the first place. And I'm not even saying that Greg and Frank here have to agree that evolution is real. Just that they stop pretending it's incompatible with Christianity.
But if in getting people to accept that there might be some problems with evolution, that's a big deal.
Especially when you can't come up with any problems that couldn't be overcome by an undergrad in biology without much more than a moment's thought.
With a lot of these folks. If we got to get them to jump through the hoop of a young Earth, do you see how much more difficult we're making the situation for ourselves?
Not really. Anti-evolution, young Earth, flat Earth, and geocentrism are all similarly implausible and stupid. I guess one could say that the fewer you ask people to accept, the better for your ideology, which would, I guess, be why anti-evolution but not young Earth might be preferable to anti-evolution but agnosticism about the age of the Earth. But you could just require none of them. That's always an option.
And so from a strategic perspective, I think it's just better to set that on the side, have intramural discussions about that issue, but not make this a point of contention on the public stage, because it makes our job very much more difficult.
Now that is irony.
Yeah, well, one more question. Yes, go ahead, Jacob.
On the Cambrian explosion, every time I've read about that, seen anything about that, like they talk about having every major type of phyla.
I think he just means most of the modern phyla, because major type of phyla is neither grammatically correct nor a semantically meaningful phrase, near as I can tell.
But then they always show like these crustacean-looking things.
There are a few Cambrian crustaceans, like Canadapsis, but most arthropods in the Cambrian are definitely not crustaceans, which I think just indicates that this guy isn't really up on his arthropod anatomy, which is okay. He's not the one representing himself as some kind of expert. He's more the victim here.
Does that include like more humanoid type looking structures?
No, humans come later.
Okay.
What an odd question. But yeah, the earliest thing I might call a humanoid would probably be the apes of the Miocene, which is hundreds of millions of years later.
I'm sorry. I mean, I just don't know anything about this. So, I mean, I'm trying to figure this all out. How does that all fit together with that?
Humans come later. Go ahead, Greg. You're gonna say.
Is there anything Greg won't butt in on? But also, I applaud this guy for admitting he doesn't know about this stuff and looking for answers. I just hope that between when this was recorded and now, he got some answers from people who actually know what they're talking about.
If you remember from high school zoology, it's kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species.
But what about superphyla and infraorders and subfamilies? Turns out things are much more complex than you learned in school, and none of these ranks actually means anything. They're all arbitrary signposts put on the objectively existing nested branching hierarchy of life. A nested hierarchy that can only be meaningfully explained with predictive power through descent with modification.
So, kingdom is the first division, plant and animal.
And fungus, and let's not forget the fact that it kind of breaks down when you're talking about what used to be called protists, but sure.
And then the phyla are the next big divisions.
Except it's not. Just counting humans, some of the taxa below kingdom but above phylum include Eumenozoa, Parahoxozoa, Bilateria, Nephrozoa, and Deuterostomia. Why aren't any of these the level under consideration for where common ancestry can begin? Maybe God created the first bilaterians, and then from that evolved humans and squid.
The important thing to keep in mind is that in terms of development, all of the major classifications of living things, not every novel feature of living things like bipedal locomotion or something like that, but every basic body structure, which is what the phyla describe, is in place at the very beginning.
Except that that's just blatantly not true. The distinctions above phyla often extend into the Precambrian, and even then, during the Cambrian, some of the modern phyla evolve after the earliest age. That's just a blatant mischaracterization of the Cambrian, the history of what we now think of as phyla, the very concept of phyla, and how taxonomy works.
Out of nowhere.
Yeah, the Ediacaran doesn't exist. Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain.
After that, it's refinements, and some of the refinements are dramatic.
But refinements also define the differences between the earliest members of the phyla, too. That's the thing. One of the predictions of evolution and universal common descent is that as you go back in time, the members of what are now very distantly related groups look more and more like each other, because as you go back in time, they're literally more and more closely related. That's why so many Cambrian creatures just come down to a different kind of worm, or a different kind of thing that has too many legs.
So you don't have any bipedal internal skeleton bone structured things in the Cambrian explosion.
That's true.
But what you do have is you have a dorsal nervous. What do they call it? Dorsal.
Notochord. Unless, of course, we're talking about protostomes, then it's the digestive system that's dorsal.
Nerve cord, chordata.
Almost.
A phylum chordata, I guess, is what we are. So all of the creatures that have a dorsal nerve cord are part of the phylum chordata, and that was established early on.
But there are still other groups related to chordates, like hemichordates, and going a bit further out, the echinoderms. So it's not just the chordata popped out of nothing. We know about its evolutionary history.
It's good to make this distinction, because what we're not saying is that pretty much everything that we see now was there then. What we're saying is that the basic body plans, which is the most foundational level of development.
Except it's not. I just mentioned 3 phyla that all share the common developmental fact that when they are developing, the first indentation that forms on the embryo becomes the anus, and the second indentation becomes the mouth. That's a more basic thing than having a notochord, and it's shared by a wider group than the phylum. So this conflation of phylum with the most basic level of shared morphology is just flatly wrong. I've already in this series gone over the similarities among the panarthropods, which include among the living tardigrada, arthropoda, and onychophora, but include even more animals in the fossil record. They too are united by even more basic aspects of their development in biology than those which unite the individual phyla. This idea that the phyla are somehow the basic level of organization within Animalia is just flatly false. It's not true. It's wrong. It's worth about as much as a presidential denial of an affair.
We're virtually all in place instantaneously in the record.
Also not true. That's why we have the Ediacaran and early Cambrian dominated by stem groups related to, but not members of modern phyla, because these phyla defining traits weren't in place in our earliest fossils.
And that there's been no additional body plans that have been added since then.
Okay.
Well, since there's no rigorous definition of what a body plan even is, we can't say. I might argue that the body plan of an octopus is fundamentally different to that of a clam, and therefore, yes, both bivalvia and cephalopoda are in fact new body plans that have evolved within mollusca. But so what? They're still mollusks, and that has been arbitrarily set as the phylum-level taxon to which they both belong. So no matter how different in body plan a cuttlefish and an oyster are, they're in the same phylum.
With maybe a couple of rare exceptions.
Yeah, I'm not strong on science, and every time I've read about this, it hasn't been clear to me what exactly they've meant by that, so thank you.
That's because creationists can't be clear on what they mean by this, because any way they could be clear about this would show that they're just wrong.
I might want to make one final point here, and it's a point we made yesterday, but it should belong in this presentation too. Even if you grant the atheist macroevolution.
Something done by every creationist I've ever interacted with, as long as you don't let the creationists redefine macroevolution.
Again, the atheist doesn't get rid of the need for a designer, because you need a creator and designer to start the universe, to design the universe.
Maybe, but I certainly haven't heard anything here that would support that contention.
To start and design life.
Not based on what I've heard in this talk. That was the whole point of this talk, and it was an abysmal failure.
Even if after you get the first life, you could explain it by some sort of natural process, which, as we pointed it out, doesn't appear to be the case. But even if that's so, you still got a creator, you still got a designer. And then we mentioned those other immaterial things we talked about, information, morality, reason. Those types of things are completely alien to the materialistic worldview.
No, they're not. They're just immersion phenomena, which are not in any way precluded by materialism. Maybe Frank has elsewhere argued that they're better explained by a supernaturalist worldview, and I don't really care. But no materialist thinks that morality or information are incompatible with their worldview.
Yet they use those things to argue against it. The very fact that these people have reasons to say that God doesn't exist shows that this is a reasonable world.
I fail to see why the consistency of nature is only explicable by means of a divine creator. Perhaps to be real, nature simply has to be consistent in some ways. I don't know.
That reasons matter.
And say again?
That reasons matter.
Yeah, that reasons
the
matter.
The process of reasoning can help us to determine what's true about the world.
And if
I mean, yeah, that's true, but these guys have been doing a piss poor job at reasoning.
if they're true, if they're right about molecules in motion, then reason doesn't even work.
Nope, I'll just repeat my calculator bit here. Look, a calculator is just electrons in motion. Yet, if I ask it to perform arithmetic functions, it reliably gives the right answer. Nothing about the possibility that mind reduces to material components indicates that it is, for that reason, incapable of coming to a correct conclusion on the basis of good evidence or rationale. If the mind boils down to ions and molecules going around doing things, that's not fundamentally different to a calculator reducing down to electrons going around doing things. And just like the latter is generally reliable, so too can be the former. I'm not saying it has to be, but I see no fundamental reason why a purely physical brain cannot produce a mind capable of reliable reasoning. Further, I see no reason why an immaterial mind must be any more or less reliable than a material one.
So always back out of this, because you can get down in the weeds on this stuff and argue over these particulars and never realize that they're trying to pull weeds with tools they don't have.
That's a new analogy for me, but I guess it works.
Right? They just don't have these tools in their materialistic worldview, so you got to back out and show them, even if you're right here, your worldview can't explain all this other thing.
And so we get to the presuppositionalist cherry on top of this shit sundae. And that's it. The rest is cringy 2000s techno that makes it seem like we're in a nightclub in the Matrix, with an address to send fan or presumably hate mail to Frank. Well, that's the last episode. It wasn't so much about science, but honestly, that's okay. It was a nice change of pace for me. I hope you appreciated it. If you enjoyed this video, please hit like and tell me what you liked in the comments. If you didn't like it, then hit dislike and let me know what the problem was. Either way, please subscribe if you haven't and turn on all notifications so that occasionally YouTube might tell you about my other content if they feel like it, regardless of your wishes. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur. Hey, before you leave, I just want to take a second to thank my patrons and channel members, especially those pledging $20 or above. Benthoven, Floravara, Tapioca Weasel, Whispers, Eleron Teller, Horseflesh, Ian Chen, Kelvin Brostek Van Manen, Landon Noel, Mabdy Babdy, Sphincter of Doom, Wallace, John Ackerman, Eta V, and Strawberry Vein. It's because of my channel members and patrons whom you're seeing on screen that this channel can stay afloat. Without you, it would all shut down. If you want to join the team, there's a link to join the channel below this video, and there's a link to join the Patreon in the description. On the Patreon, you can get a 10% discount for pledging annually, and either way, you get early access to virtually all of my scripted videos, often 3 to 5 months before they come out for the general public. Thanks for watching.